Okay, good afternoon everyone. So welcome to Calculus 1 and we have now discussed our last topic that is trigonometric functions. Now let's proceed to our next topic that is the transformation of functions. This will be our last topic in lesson 1 that involves functions. So here listed are the subtopics under this topic, transformation of functions. Those are or these are combination of functions, composition of two functions, vertical translation, and our horizontal translation. So isa-isahin po natin yan siya. So first, let's proceed to our combination of functions. So suppose that f and g are functions with domain d1 and d2 respectively. So the domain of f is d1 or the set d1 and the domain of our g is the set d2. So the functions sum of f and g, the difference of f and g, and the product of f and g are defined by here. So f plus g of x is or can also be defined or determined by the sum of the individual function f of x plus our g of x. So is in our difference of the two functions that is f and g. So the difference of f and g of x is just equal to the difference of f of x minus g of x. Okay? Another one, the product of g of x is just that of f of x times our g of x. So the product, the sum, difference, and product of our individual functions being considered. So we have to see to it that our x should be the common or our domain x should be the common element of our domains d1 and d2 such that denoted by this one. Kapag common elements gani, yun siya ang ating tinatawag na the intersection. Okay? So the intersection of our domain 1 and domain 2, that is the intersection of the domain of our f and the domain of our g, that is the domain of our combination of our two functions. We say that x should be the element of our domain 1 and should also be the element of our domain 2. Okay? So here in our quotient of our function, that is f denoted by f divided by g or f over g is defined by f of x or f, the quotient of f and g of x is equal to f of x over g of x. So same po sila ng condition, that is our domain x should be the common element of our d1 and our d2 such that g of x should not be equal to 0. Why so? Because if we have our g of x, our denominator, which is equal to 0, then our function will not be defined. So in order for us to circumvent our 0 denominator, we have to see to it that our denominator g of x should not be equal to 0. Okay? Applying our functions here or our combination of functions, we have to consider our examples. So here our example number 1. If our f of x is given by x minus 3 and our g of x is given by the square root of x minus 1, so we are asked to determine f plus g, 3f minus g, and our f over g, stating each the domains of each functions, combination of functions. So here we are given the two functions, f of x and g of x. Then we are asked to determine here f plus g, 3f minus g, and f over g. And then we are going to state the domains of that functions, okay? Or the combination of these functions. So first, the solution would be the domain of f is the entire number line, while that of g is the set of all x greater than or equal to 1. So we have to determine first the domains of our individual function f and g. So here we have our polynomial function. So I have to say, or please be reminded that the domain of all polynomial function is the entire number line, or that is from negative infinity to positive infinity. This is the domain of all polynomial functions. Since our f of x is a polynomial function that is defined by our linear equation x minus 3, then we say that f of x is, the domain of f of x is the entire number line. But here in our g of x, we are given by a function square root of x minus 1. So we say that the domain of this one, in order for our g of x to be defined, we should have our x which is greater than or equal to 1. Why so? Because or such that if we have our 1, x equals 1, substitute into our function square root of x minus 1, then this can be defined. That is 1 minus 1 is equal to 0. Then square root of 0 has a number, has a value which is equal to 0. Then if our x is greater than 1, say 2, 3, 4, or 5, then this function can also be defined. G of x can also be defined since square root of 2 minus 1 can be defined, 3 minus 1 can be defined, 4 minus 1 can be defined, also, and so is our 5 minus 1 can be defined. Okay? But if our x is less than 1, say for example that is negative 1. So if we have our x less than tawag nito, if we have our x which is equal to negative 1, then the g of x po natin will not be defined because we have our square root of x po natin negative 1 minus 1. Negative 1 minus 1 is equal to negative 2. So the square root of a negative number is a complex number. So here we are now, we are dealing with a real number here in our calculus. We are not dealing with our complex number. Okay? Complex number are those number that is imaginary, like that of the square root of a negative number. Okay? So, yun lang po. And then, let's proceed. That is f plus g of x, which is equal to the individual sum of our f and g. That is, this is our f of x, x plus 3, plus our g of x, square root of x minus 1. So, simplifying that one, this is now just a simplified form of our sum of g of x, g of f, sum of g and f and g of x. Okay? So now let's proceed here in our number 2, that is 3f minus g of x. Okay, 3 times the individual function f po natin, 3 times f of x. Here 3x minus 1 minus g of x, that is square root of x minus 1. So simplifying this one, 3 times 3 is equal to 3 times x is equal to 3x. Then 3 times negative 3 is equal to negative 9 minus the square root of x minus 1. So what is or are the domains of this one, of our given function? So we say that the domain of f, the sum of f and g and the difference of 3f and g is just x such that x is greater than or equal to 1. Okay? Why so? Because if kung wala po tayong square root of x minus 1 and here square root of x minus 1, then the domain should be the entire number line. But we have here the square root of x minus 1 and the square root of x minus 1. So the domain would be x such that, the set of x such that x is greater than or equal to 1 in order for this function to be defined. Like as what I have explained earlier here in our domain of our g of x. Okay? So now, here we have our, we have to define the combination of the quotient of f and g. So, f over g of x is equal to f of x over g of x. That is, f of x po natin is equal to x minus 3 and then g of x po natin is equal to square root of x minus 1. So now the domain is, or we have to define the domain of this function. The domain should be the set of x, should be a set of x such that x is greater than 1, where we have added the restriction x is not equal to 1. Okay? Because we have here square root of x minus 1, so that can be defined. Okay? This can be defined, square root of x minus 1 can be defined at x greater than or equal to 1. But we have restricted here our x which is not equal to 1. Why so? Because if we have our x which is equal to 1, that should be our denominator would become 0. So we have to avoid that denominator should be equal to 0 in order for our function to be defined. So instead of our domain that would be x greater than or equal to 1, we have now restricted our x which is not equal to 1. So the remainder would be the domain is a set of x such that x is greater than 1 in order for our g of x not to be equal to 0. That is also in order for our function, the combination of our function f over g of x to be defined. Okay? Now, let's proceed to our composition of two functions. So it is shown in the previous example on how to do the arithmetic operations with functions. So, kanina po yan. However, some functions do not correspond to arithmetic operations, such is the composition of two functions. Okay? Combination of two functions po tayo kanina, then that is the arithmetic solutions, operations of our functions that we are going to deal with. But here in our composition of two functions, iba po siya. We have here our definition, the composition of functions f and g written by composition function of f and g that is defined by composition function of f and g of x is equal to f of g of x. So that is for all x such that x is in the domain of g and g of x is in the domain of f. Okay? Tandaan po natin, dapat po ang x natin is in the domain of our g. Then our g of x also is in the domain of our f. Okay? Parang two-step process po siya. So that is the composition of two functions. The composition of f and g of x is equal to f of g of x. So that is the composition of function is a two-step process, or like this one, as indicated in figure 1 here. So for f of g of x to be defined, you first need g of x to be defined. So x must be in the domain of g. Next, f must be defined at the point g of x, so that the number g of x will need to be in the domain of f. So very po to siya intindihin, parang complicated po siya intindihin. But we can understand that one easily by considering our example here. So if we have our composition of two functions, here we are going to consider. For f of x which is equal to x squared plus 1 and g of x which is equal to square root of x minus 2, we are going to find the composition of f and g and the composition function of g and f, and identify the domain of each. So first here we are given, or we have to find, isa-isahin po natin yan siya. This one and then this one. Unahin po natin si composition function of g and of f and g. So here the composition function of f and g of x is equal to f of g of x. So first we have here since this is equal to f of g of x, so we have our f of x, di ba po? We have our f of x. So instead of writing f of x, f of x po natin is equal to x squared plus 1. Okay? But the composition function of our f and g is f of g of x. Then, instead of writing x that 1, gawin po natin yan siyang g of x. So, f of g of x. Okay, which is equal to x squared plus 1. But g of x po natin is square root of x minus 2. So, we have f of square root of x minus 2, which is equal to x squared plus 1. Okay? Then, how do we simplify this one? By simplifying that one, we have to substitute the values of our variables here as our variable here, as our defined by our function here. But this function, we have to substitute the values of our x here in the right side of our equation as square root of x minus 2. So that is f of g of x, or f of square root of x minus 2 is equal to square root of x minus 2, that is our x, squared plus 1. Okay? Simplifying that one, canceling out our square, matitira na lang po is, dito na po siya, x minus 2 plus 1. Okay? Then, simplifying again, we can now have x minus 1. Okay? So, we say that x minus 1 is a polynomial. So, we say that or we can write that our function or the resulting function would be, the domain of the resulting function would be the entire number line. Okay, we say that one. But that is wrong. Why so? Because here, but note that for x to be in the domain of G, for x to be in the domain of G, we must have x which is greater than or equal to 2. Here, we have to consider this one. We have to consider the domain of our G. The domain of our G is the set of x such that x is greater than or equal to 2 in order for our G of x to be defined. Okay? So here say kanina that our x should be, in order for our function f of g of x to be defined, you first need g of x to be defined so that x must be in the domain of G. Okay? So x must be in the domain of G, then f must be defined at the point g of x so that the number g of x will need to be in the domain of f. So, in order for our g of x to be in the domain of f, we need first to define the domain of our g of x. Okay? So, the domain of our g of x is a set of x such that x is greater than or equal to 2. So, here, the domain of f is the entire number line since this is a polynomial. Okay? So, this places no further restrictions in the domain of the composition function of our composition function of our f and g. So even though the final expression states that this is a polynomial given by our linear equation that is x minus 1 is defined for all x, the domain therefore of our composition function of our f and g is a set of x such that x is greater than or equal to 2. Okay? So, hindi po necessarily na kung ano po ang sagot nandyan, yun na po ang, kung ano po ang sagot natin dito, lahat po ng x that can be substituted in that one should be in that should be the domain of our f of g of x. That is wrong. Okay? We have to consider also that the domain should satisfy both our f and our g. Okay? Next, for our G combination or composition function of our the function composition of our G and F of X, that is G of F of X. So, first, if we are given by our, since nauna po ang G natin dito, pangalawa po ang ating F, then that would result to G of F of X. So, but our g of x is defined by g of x is defined by sana yan? G of x square root of x minus 2. Then the composition function of our g of x, g of f of x, that is g of, instead of x we have our f of x, which is equal to square root of x minus 2. But f of x po natin is given by x squared plus 1. So we have g of x squared plus 1, which is equal to square root of x minus 2. Okay? So g of x squared plus 1 is equal to square root of x minus 2. So we have to substitute the variables in the right side of our equation by our value here, f of x, which is x squared plus 1. So that would result to, papalitan po natin to siya ng x squared plus 1. So magiging, this is our x na, x squared plus 1, that is x. X po natin yan siya dito, noted, minus our 2. But our x is x squared plus 1 minus 2. So simplifying this one, square root of x squared minus 1, because 1 minus 2 is equal to negative 1. So we say here that in order for our x to be defined, or our g of f of x to be defined, this should be equal to or greater than or equal to 0. Our x squared minus 1, or that is inside our radical sign, should be greater than or equal to 0. Okay? So here, simplifying our inequality, that is x squared minus 1 greater than or equal to 1. Simplifying our inequality, we have now, that is 0 pala, no, not 1. That would be x squared should be greater than or equal to 1. Okay? Then, this results to, since greater than or equal to 1, then this is x squared and this is just our 1. So, we can have or we can simplify that the absolute value of our x is greater than or equal to 1. Okay? Since the inside function f is defined for all x here, defined for all x, the domain g of f of x is the x, which is the element of the entire number line, such that the absolute value of our x is greater than or equal to 1. Okay? Or that is the x squared is greater than or equal to 1. And this can also, domain of that, or since the domain is defined by this one, this can also be written as negative infinity to negative 1, included po ang negative 1, union positive 1 to positive infinity. Or we can have this one. Okay? X squared, which is greater than or equal to 1, or the absolute value of x is greater than or equal to 1. Okay? So, now, here we have given by our example, considering this one. Identify, napakalayo man ang I. Okay. Identify functions f and g such that the given function can be written as f of g of x. So, for each of this, each of 1a square root of x squared plus 1, b is square root of x plus 1 squared, then c sine x squared, and d cosine squared x. Note that more than one answer is possible for each function. So, we have more than one answer possible in each function. But, isa-isahin po natin yung pinaka-simple po. So, ano pong hinahanap natin dito? Since we are given now f of g of x, or that is the composition function of our f and our g of x, or that is can be defined as or can be written as f of g of x, which is equal to itong apat, square root of x squared plus 1, square root of x plus 1 squared, sine x squared, and then cosine squared x. So, ano pong hinahanap natin? Since, for considering our letter A, that is square root of x squared plus 1. So, how do we define? Since f of g of x is defined na po siya as our x squared of x squared plus 1. So, ang hinahanap po natin dito is yung function na f and function of g. So, what is our f of x here, and what is also our g of x? Ano po yan siya? In order for our f of g of x to be square root of x squared plus 1. So here, we say that one choice can have g of x should be square root of, or that is x squared plus 1. And then we have our f of x, which is equal to square root of our x. Okay, why so? Because if we have f of g of x, which is equal to, since we are dealing with f of x, square root of x, then f of g of x, that is f of x squared plus 1, is equal to the square root of x. Then we have our simplified form, f of x squared plus 1 is equal to, palitan po natin sa right side, variables in our right side of our equation by x squared plus 1. So we have now x squared plus 1. And this results to our original equation, which is x squared plus 1. Okay? So, one possible solution would be g of x is x squared plus 1 and f of x is the square root of our x. So, ang ibig sabihin lang po niyan is we have to separate these A, B, and C. We have to divide that we have to divide, or we have to make this into two functions. Okay? We have to divide our original functions into two functions. such that if we have to get the composition of the two functions, that would result to our original function given by these A, B, C, and D respectively. Okay? So, paano po namin malalaman yan, sir? Ang one way to identify the g of x and f of x is that um, kung sino po ang nasa loob ng parentheses or nasa loob ng parentheses, nasa loob ng square root, nasa loob ng ano tawag ito? Nasa loob ng radical signs, naka-square, yun po ang ating g of x. Ang ating ano naman, ang ating f of x naman is siya yung ang tawag ito, siya ang nag-square root, siya ang nag-square, siya ang nag-radical sa ating given function. So here, considering here in our letter A, example letter A, that is g of x po natin is nasa loob ng radical sign. So we have our g of x which is x squared plus 1. Ang matitira na lang po, ito po, papalitan po natin yan siya ng x. Kung kinuha po natin yan siya as x squared plus 1 as our g of x, so papalitan po natin yan siya ng just x. Such that f of g of x is square root of x. But g of x is x squared plus 1. Then substitute that x squared plus 1 into our square root of x, magiging square root of x squared plus 1 na siya. Okay? But again, in our letter B, considering our example letter B, so like I said po, kung ano po ang nasa loob ng ating, parentheses or nasa loob ng ating square root, dun po ang ating g of x. Okay? So here, one example po, since marami po siyang solution dito na makukuha natin, ito, at ito. But one example or one solution would be, g of x po natin is yung nasa loob ng ating parentheses. That is x squared plus 1. Ang matitira na lang po, papalitan po natin yan siya ng x. Okay? Kaya x squared na lang po ang matitira sa ating f of x. Okay. Then, we have here in our letter C, sine x squared. Here, we have our x that is squared. Okay? So, may exponent po ang ating x dito. So, g of x po natin is x squared. Then, our f of x is just sine x. Okay? Such that, kung papalitan po natin ang x na ito ng x squared, magiging sin x squared na siya. Like this one. Kung papalitan natin ang x na ito ng x squared plus 1, magiging, bakit x squared plus 1? Square root of x to siya. That is square root of x plus 1. Papalitan po natin to siya ng square root of x plus 1, magiging square root of x plus 1 squared na po siya. Okay? Kung ito po naman, papalitan po natin yan siya ng x squared plus 1, magiging square root of x squared plus 1 na siya. Okay? Then, we have to consider again example letter D. Example letter D, that is given by cosine squared x. But, our cosine here, na-square po ang ating cosine, or that can be written as cosine x squared. Okay? Since cosine x is nasa loob ng ating parentheses, so we can say or we can have this as a function of g. Okay? Function of x denoted by our g. So, g of x po natin should be cosine x. Then, f of x po natin, papalitan po natin siya ng x, that is x squared. Such that, kung papalitan natin ang ating x nito ng cosine x, magiging cosine x squared. Or that can also be written as cosine squared x. Okay? So, next example would be our vertical translation, our horizontal translation of our graph. So, stay tuned. Exit ko po muna yung video. Okay.